If someone had told me 10 years ago, when I was just a gangly teenager skinning my knuckles on my first engine, that my life would be defined by the man who lived at the end of the street, I would have laughed. Not just any man. Marcus Thorne, my best friend Liam's dad. The quiet, intimidating monolith of a man who moved through our suburban world like a ghost, all sharp angles and quiet disapproval. I didn't come here to this small town garage with its smell of oil and old regrets, looking for love. I came here looking for a place to hide. But sometimes, the thing you're hiding from is the only thing that can save you. My world was small, and I liked it that way. It was the four walls of my garage, the predictable logic of an internal combustion engine, and the quiet solitude of my tiny apartment above. Each day was a copy of the one before. Coffee black, overalls stained, the low hum of the radio drowned out by the scream of an impact wrench. It was a rhythm, a routine, a fortress against the chaos of feeling too much. I'd known Liam Thorne since kindergarten. We were an odd pair. He was the sun, bright, loud, effortlessly popular. I was the shadow that trailed him, content to exist in his orbit, never needing the light for myself. His friendship was a passport to a life I observed but never truly lived. Summer barbecues at his house, pool parties, holiday dinners. I was always there, the quiet friend, the fixture, Lao. And at the center of that world, silent and unmoving, was his father. Marcus. From a distance, he was easy to define. A contractor, a widower, a man carved from granite and grief. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that sucked the air out of a room. When he looked at you, his eyes, a startlingly pale gray, seemed to see every flaw, every hesitation. He didn't speak much. He'd nod a greeting, his mouth a flat, unsmiling line. He'd watch the boisterous energy of his son and his friends with a kind of detached weariness. My teenage self had cataloged him as an antagonist. The stern father, the obstacle, the reason Liam always had a curfew. But as I got older, my observation sharpened. I started noticing things from my peripheral vision. The way his hands, calloused and capable, were never truly still. They were always checking a level, tightening a loose screw on a deck chair, fixing something. I noticed the exhaustion etched around his eyes, a permanent fixture. I saw the way he'd stand by the grill, away from the chatter, and his gaze would drift to a faded photograph of his late wife on the mantelpiece inside. He was not an antagonist. He was a man drowning in silence. And something in me, the part that understood the comfort of quiet rooms and unspoken feelings, recognized a kindred spirit. My fear of him slowly, over years, curdled into a strange, secret fascination, a longing I couldn't name. It was an impossible, ridiculous ache for a man who barely knew my name. So I kept my distance. He was Liam's dad. He was 20 years my senior. He was a fortress, and I didn't have the courage to even knock on the gate. The space between us was a chasm, defined by age, by loss, by the simple, unbridgeable fact that I was just the quiet kid who fixed Liam's car for free. That was the status quo, the rigid, predictable structure of my life, until the storm came. It wasn't just a storm, it was a deluge, a violent tantrum thrown by the sky. The wind howled for 2 days straight, tearing at roofs and turning ancient oaks into kindling. My own garage rattled, the metal roof groaning under the assault. I spent most of it in my apartment, listening to the rain lash against the windows, feeling a primal sort of comfort in the world being as unsettled as my own mind. Liam was gone. He'd taken a summer job counseling at a camp 3 states away. No cell service, just a promise to call when he could. It meant the Thorne house was empty, except for Marcus. A fact that sat in my mind, a smooth, heavy stone I kept turning over and over. The call came on the second night. The power had been out for hours. My apartment was lit by a single candle, its flame dancing in the drafts. My phone, which rarely rang, buzzed against the wooden table with a startling violence. The screen lit up with a name I never expected to see. Marcus Thorne. My heart became a frantic, trapped bird in my chest. I answered on the 4th ring, trying to sound like I hadn't just been holding my breath. Leo, his voice was rough, strained. stripped of its usual low authority. It was just frayed. I need you, 3 words. That was all it took to dismantle the fortress I'd spent a decade building. I need you. What's wrong? My own voice was a croak. The oak, he said, and I could hear the wind whipping through the phone. The big one in the backyard. It came down. Right on the workshop, a pause. A shaky breath. The truck's in there, Leo. The roof, it's not going to hold the truck. A 1968 Ford F-100. Seafoam green. A relic he and his wife had restored together. It never left the workshop, a pristine monument to a life that was over. I understood. This wasn't about a vehicle. It was about a memory. It was about the last piece of her he could touch. I'm on my way, I said, already pulling on my boots. No hositashchen. No thought. Just a primal, magnetic pull toward the center of that storm. Toward him. The drive was treacherous. Debris littered the roads, and the rain was a solid wall against my windshield. But the chaos outside was a pale imitation of the tempest inside me. For years, he had been a fixed point in my sky, distant and untouchable. Now I was being summoned, pulled into his orbit by a crisis that had shattered his legendary composure. When I pulled into his driveway, the scene was worse than I'd imagined. The massive oak tree was a fallen giant, its trunk splintered and raw. It had crushed the back half of his detached workshop, the roof sagging at a sickening angle. A single, bare bulb, powered by a generator whose roar I could now hear, cast a sickly yellow light over the destruction. And there he was, Marcus, standing in the rain, soaked to the bone, staring at the wreckage. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. Defeated. The impenetrable fortress was breached. The walls were down. He turned as my headlights washed over him. His face was pale, his hair plastered to his forehead. For a moment, he just looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not the intimidating patriarch, but a man utterly lost. The distance between us, that vast, uncrossable chasm, suddenly felt like nothing more than a few feet of rain-soaked asphalt. And I walked across it. Let's see what we're dealing with, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He just nodded, a jerky, desperate motion, and led me toward the broken building. The air was thick with the smell of splintered pine, wet earth, and something else. Fear. Inside was organized chaos. Tools neatly hung on pegboards on the walls that were still standing. Sawdust coating every surface. In the center of it all, the truck. The fallen rafters had missed it by inches, but one of the main support beams was cracked, groaning under the weight of the tree in the rain. It was a ticking clock. I was in my element now. The fear and awe receded, replaced by the cool, clear logic of mechanics and physics. This was a problem I could solve. I started assessing angles, stress points, exit paths. My world narrowed to the task at hand, a blessed relief from the emotional overload. Marcus was just watching me. His stillness was unnerving. He was a man of action, a builder, yet he stood there, helpless. This was my domain. For the first time, I wasn't Liam's quiet friend. I was the expert, the one with the answers. We need to brace that main beam, I said, pointing. Then we need to clear a path. Can we get the door open? My words seemed to shake him from his stupor. He blinked, then nodded. Yeah, I think so. We worked. For hours. The generator hummed, a constant companion to the rhythm of our labor and the drumming of the rain. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. I'd point, he'd move. I'd ask for a tool. It would appear in my hand. We moved around each other in the cramped, dangerous space, a silent, efficient dance. It was in this close proximity that the details I'd only glimpsed from afar came into sharp, undeniable focus. I saw the fine silver threads in his dark hair, plastered to his temples with sweat and rain. I saw the faint, white line of a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a detail I'd never noticed in 20 years. I saw the deep lines of exhaustion bracketing his mouth. He wasn't a granite statue. He was a man, tired and scared and achingly human. He was holding a heavy-duty floor jack, positioning it where I'd instructed. His hands, which I'd always seen as symbols of pure strength, were trembling slightly. Not from the weight, but from the strain, the adrenaline, the fear. My heart twisted with a surge of protectiveness so fierce it stole my breath. "I've got it," I said, my voice softer than I intended. I reached out to steady the jack, to guide it into place. And that's when it happened. The first touch. My hand covered his on the cold steel handle. His skin was rough, calloused, but radiating a startling heat that shot up my arm like a current. It wasn't a brush. It wasn't an accident. For a split second, my fingers pressed into the back of his hand. A moment of contact. Solid. Real. The world stopped. The roar of the generator, the pounding of the rain, the groaning of the broken roof. It all faded into a dull, distant hum. All I could feel was the shocking, terrifying warmth of his hand under mine. My mind went completely blank. A white screen of pure sensation. Heat. Rough skin. Strong knuckles. Mine. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned. My face flushed, a wave of heat crawling on my neck. I suddenly couldn't look at him. I focused intently on a crack in the concrete floor, my heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted out. Did he feel that? Did he notice? Of course he noticed, you idiot. You grabbed his hand. I risked a glance. He was staring at his own hand, still on the jack, with a strange, unreadable expression. His jaw was tight. He didn't say anything. He just took a slow breath and then looked back at me. His pale gray eyes were dark in the lantern light. And for the first time, they weren't looking through me. They were looking at me, seeing me. The power dynamic, which had already begun to shift, now tilted completely on its axis. He was no longer just the intimidating father figure. I was no longer just the helpful kid. We were two men in a broken building in the middle of a storm, and something had just passed between us. Something fragile and unnamed and terrifying. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "Right," he said, his voice rough. "Here." He gestured with his chin at the spot for the jack. Yeah, I managed to say, my own voice thin. Right there, we went back to work, but the spell of easy, silent cooperation was broken. Now, the air was thick with a new kind of tension. Every time we passed in the narrow space, every time our shoulders nearly brushed, a jolt went through me. I was intensely, painfully aware of his physical presence, the breadth of his shoulders, the scent of him, rain and sawdust, and something uniquely, muscly him. It was intoxicating and agonizing. He was vulnerable. He had admitted, without words, that he needed me. And in that vulnerability, he had become more compelling, more real than the distant figure my fantasies had ever been. My carefully constructed walls of solitude and observation were crumbling, washed away by the storm, and I was left standing in the wreckage, exposed. It took another hour to secure the beam and clear a path. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle. The worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a profound, dripping silence. We had done it. The truck was accessible. The immediate danger was over. "Okay," I said, wiping a smear of grease from my forehead with the back of my arm. "I think we could try to roll it out now." Marcus just nodded, his gaze fixed on the seafoam green fender. "This was hers," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "She loved this stupid truck. Picked the color. Said it matched her eyes." He ran a hand over the hood, a gesture of infinite tenderness. "We were going to drive it up the coast. When we retired, he was talking to me, sharing a piece of his past, a piece of his pain. He was opening a door I never thought I'd be allowed to approach, let alone enter. My role had shifted from mechanic to something else. Confidant. Witness. It's a beautiful truck," I said, because it was all I could think of. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. He looked at me, a faint, sad smile touching his lips for the first time all night. "You get it," he said. "Liam, he just sees a pile of old metal. He doesn't understand." The implication hung in the air between us. "You understand me." We managed to get the truck into neutral and, with a great deal of effort, rolled it out of the crippled garage and into the relative safety of the driveway. As the wheels cleared the threshold, Marcus let out a long, shuddering sigh. The tension that had held him rigid for hours finally drained away, leaving him slumped against the driver's side door. "Thank you, Leo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked utterly spent. I couldn't have done this alone any time," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. We stood there for a long moment in the pre-dawn gloom, the sky slowly lightening from black to a bruised purple. The only sounds were the dripping of water from the trees and our own tired breathing. We were both covered in mud, grease, and sawdust. Exhausted, but we were on the other side of the crisis. The world had shifted. "Come on inside," he said, finally pushing himself off the truck. "You can't drive home like this." "I'll make some coffee." It wasn't a question. It was a quiet statement of fact. And I followed him. The house was dark and silent. It felt empty, a space built for a family that had shrunk to just one. In the kitchen, he flicked a switch out of habit, then cursed softly when nothing happened. He lit a couple of candles, and the room was filled with a warm, flickering glow. It felt impossibly intimate. This was his space, the heart of his home, and I was in it. He moved with a familiar economy, filling a kettle to heat on the gas stove, getting down 2 mugs. I just stood awkwardly by the door, feeling too big, too dirty for this clean, quiet space. I felt like an intruder. "Sit down," he said, nodding toward the small kitchen table. "Don't worry about the mess." I sat. The chair was warm, as if he'd been sitting there just before the storm hit. The table was worn, with faint scratches and water rings, the map of 1,000 family meals. I could almost hear the ghosts of laughter, of arguments, of life. And now, there was just the hiss of the gas flame and the ticking of a battery-powered clock on the wall. He brought the coffee over. It was instant, but it smelled like heaven. He sat opposite me, wrapping his large hands around the mug, as if for warmth. We drank in silence for a while. The silence wasn't like before. It wasn't the awkward, distant silence of barbecues. This was a shared silence, a comfortable wait. "I haven't had anyone over in a long time," he said, staring into his mug. Not since Liam's last birthday party." It was a confession, a small, painful admission of loneliness. "It's a nice house," I said, again feeling the inadequacy of my words. He looked up, and his gray eyes pinned me. The candlelight carved shadows into his face, making him look both older and younger at the same time. "She made it a home," he said. "I'm just living in it." He took a deep, shuddering breath. God, I'm so tired of being alone. There it was. The raw, unvarnished truth. The kind of vulnerability people only show when they are exhausted or terrified, or both. He wasn't talking to Liam's friend anymore. He was talking to the man who had stood with him in the storm, the man whose hand he had touched, the man who understood the language of loss without needing it translated. My heart ached for him. The ridiculous, secret crush I'd harbored for years evaporated, burned away by something far more potent. Empathy, connection, a fierce, desperate desire to ease his pain. "You're not alone tonight," I said, my voice barely a whisper. It was a bold statement, a step over a line I had never dared to approach. His gaze intensified. He searched my face, and I felt stripped bare, as if he could see every stupid, hopeful, terrified thought in my head. The silence stretched thin and taut. The air grew heavy, thick with everything unsaid between us for the last 10 years. He was the one who broke it. He reached across the small table, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't say a word. He just laid his hand, palm up, on the worn wood between us. An offering, an invitation, a question. My breath hitched. My entire world narrowed to that hand. That strong, calloused, trembling hand. This was it. The point of no return. I could pretend I didn't understand. I could finish my coffee, say good night, and go back to my safe, lonely life. Or I could answer. I lifted my own hand, my movements feeling sluggish, as if moving through water. It shook. I was so afraid. Afraid of what this meant. Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of wanting something so much it felt like it could break me. I placed my hand in his. His fingers closed around mine, his grip firm, definite. The same jolt from the garage, but 100 times stronger. A fire that started in my fingertips and spread through my entire body. It wasn't just heat. It was recognition. A feeling of coming home. He never broke eye contact. His thumb stroked slowly, deliberately over my knuckles. A simple, devastating gesture. He was tracing the grease stains, the old scars, the the evidence of my life's work. And he wasn't pulling away. "Leo," he whispered, my name a prayer on his lips. And then he stood up, gently pulling me with him. He led me from the kitchen, through the dark, silent house. My feet were clumsy. My heart was a drum against my ribs. We stopped in the living room, a space dominated by a large stone fireplace and the faint scent of wood smoke and old books. The only light came from the windows, the world outside now a soft, pearlescent gray. He turned to face me, still holding my hand. He lifted his other hand and gently, so gently, brushed a stray piece of sawdust from my cheek. His touch was feather-light, but left a trail of fire in its wake. "You're a good man," he said, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't decipher. "This is it. This is happening." The thought was a wild, incredulous scream in the quiet of my mind. He leaned in, slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to stop him, to break the spell. His eyes searched mine, asking a final, silent question. I didn't have the words to answer, so I just stood my ground. I leaned in just a fraction of an inch, closing the last of the distance myself. My answer. His lips met mine. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss. It was soft. It was hesitant. It was a question, a discovery. His lips were chapped, tasting faintly of coffee and rain. It was a kiss of profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a tentative, fragile hope. It was the most honest thing I had ever felt. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine. We were breathing the same air. His hand came up to cup the back of my neck, his thumb stroking my skin. "I'm too old for you," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against my lips. "This is complicated, I don't care," I whispered back, and it was the truest thing I had ever said. He kissed me again, and this time there was less hesitation. There was a decade of unspoken words, of lonely nights, of quiet observation. It was a kiss that sealed the end of one life and the beginning of another, all in the gray light of a storm-battered dawn. I don't remember walking to the couch. I just remember the feeling of his arms around me, the solid weight of him, the sense of being anchored after a lifetime of drifting. We didn't do anything more. We just held each other. We lay on the old leather sofa, fully clothed, grimy and exhausted, and for the first time in my adult life, I fell asleep in someone else's arms. I fell asleep feeling safe. The morning came too soon. I woke with a start, disoriented. The light streaming through the living room window was bright, unforgiving. The storm was a memory. The world was back to normal. And I was alone. I sat up, my heart immediately beginning a frantic, anxious rhythm. The couch was empty. The house was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a hollow, echoing silence. The absence of him was a physical presence. A folded blanket lay at the end of the couch, one I didn't remember from the night before. He must have put it on me. A small, kind gesture that somehow made the emptiness feel even sharper. My clothes were stiff with dried mud. I felt disgusting, out of place, a remnant of the night's chaos in the pristine morning light. The internal monologue started, a vicious, familiar spiral of doubt. What have you done? It was a mistake. He was tired, lonely, not thinking straight. You took advantage. He regrets it. My stomach was a pit full of angry bees. I stood up, my muscles aching. I had to get out of there. I couldn't face him. I couldn't bear to see the regret, the polite dismissal in his eyes. I crept toward the kitchen, my boots silent on the hardwood floor. There was a note on the table, next to a fresh mug of coffee that was already going cold. His handwriting was a sharp, masculine script. Had to run out. Insurance adjuster. Help yourself to coffee. We'll settle up for your work when I get back. Settle up. The words hit me like a physical blow. Settle up. It was a transaction. A job. He was putting the walls back up, brick by painful brick. The intimacy of the night, the confession, the kiss, it was being reclassified as a moment of weakness, a temporary insanity brought on by the storm. And I was the mechanic who needed to be paid for his time. The shame was a hot, bitter flood in my throat. I felt like a fool, a naive, stupid boy who had mistaken a moment of desperation for something real. I didn't touch the coffee. I turned and fled. I didn't even close the door quietly behind me. I just ran, Back to my truck, back to the safety of my own world, the smell of grease and solitude, a horribly welcome comfort. The next 2 days were a special kind of hell. My apartment, once my sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The silence I had once cultivated was now deafening. It was filled with his absence. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the ghost of his lips on mine, the memory of his hand in my hand. And every time, the memory was followed by the cold slap of his note. Settle up. My phone remained silent. I checked it obsessively, my thumb hovering over his name and my contacts. Would I even say, hey, about that earth-shattering moment of connection, was that just me? The thought was so pathetic it made me sick. He didn't call. He didn't text. Nothing. The push and pull of hope and despair was exhausting. One moment, I convinced myself he was just busy, overwhelmed with the damage. The next, I was certain he was trying to figure out the kindest way to let me down, to pretend it never happened. Maybe he was afraid I'd tell Liam. Maybe he was just disgusted with himself. With me. The solitude I had built my life around was no longer a comfort. It was a punishment. It was a constant, glaring reminder of what I had touched for a brief, fleeting moment, and what I had now lost. I had been fine being alone before, but now I knew what it felt like not to be. The absence was a phantom limb, an ache for something that was no longer there. On the third day, I had resigned myself to the truth. It was a fluke, a one-time thing. I would have to see him again, eventually. I would be polite. I would take his money for the job, and I would go back to being Liam's quiet friend, the fixture in the background. Only now I would be carrying this secret, this shard of glass in my heart. I was under a car, wrestling with a rusted bolt, when a shadow fell over me. I didn't have to look. I knew. I knew the shape of him, the way he displaced the air. My heart stopped. I slowly slid out from under the chassis on my creeper, wiping my hands on a rag, steeling myself. I kept my eyes down, focusing on the grease under my fingernails. I couldn't look at him. Leo, his voice was low, strained, the same way it had sounded on the phone during the storm. I finally forced myself to look up. He looked terrible, worse than he had in the rain. His eyes were bloodshot, with dark circles underneath. He hadn't shaved. He wore the same jeans from the other night, now clean, but he looked rumpled, undone. The confident, imposing Marcus Thorne was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he'd been through a war. He was just standing there in the middle of my garage, my space. He held nothing in his hands. He had no excuse for being there. He just stood, radiating a palpable aura of misery and conflict. You left, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. A sad, quiet fact. Your note. I said, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. Said you had to go. Said we'd settle up. I put a sarcastic, bitter spin on the last two words. He flinched, as if I'd struck him. That was stupid, he said, shaking his head. I didn't know what to say. I woke up, and you were there, sleeping on my couch, and all I could think was, what have I done? I panicked. He took a hesitant step closer. I'm 45 years old, Leo. I have a son your age. My whole life, I've been one thing. A husband, a father, a straight man. And then the storm, and you, and I felt something I haven't felt in 20 years. Something I didn't think I was capable of feeling again. And it terrified me. His confession hung in the oil-scented air between us. It was raw, honest, and painful. He wasn't rejecting me. He was just scared, as scared as I was. I thought you regretted it, I said, my voice small. I thought it was a mistake. Leaving you that note was the mistake, he said, his voice firm now. He took another step, closing the distance between us. Not kissing you. God, not that. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a second before he gently cupped my jaw. His thumb stroked my cheek. These last 2 days, not calling you, it's been hell. The silence was worse than the storm. I leaned into his touch, my eyes fluttering shut. The relief was so overwhelming it felt like I might collapse. He wasn't pushing me away. He was just as lost as I was. I was scared too. I admitted, my voice muffled against his palm. Scared of what you'd think in the morning. Scared of what Liam would think. Scared this was just a moment. Wasn't just a moment, he said, his voice a low, fierce whisper. Leo, look at me. I opened my eyes. His face was inches from mine. The pale gray eyes that had once seemed so cold and distant were now filled with a desperate, vulnerable warmth. "I don't know what this is," he said. "I don't know where it goes. All I know is that for the first time since she died, my house didn't feel empty. And when you're gone, it was unbearable. I don't want to feel that again. This was it." The clarifying conversation. The moment where we chose to step into the terrifying, unknown territory together, or retreat to our lonely corners. "Me neither," I said. A slow smile spread across his face. It transformed him, erasing the years of grief and exhaustion. For a second, I saw the man his wife must have fallen in love with. He dropped his hand from my face and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a single, shiny new key on a simple metal ring. He pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. It was cool against my skin. I looked at it, then back at him confused. "It's for the workshop," he said. "The insurance is covering the repairs, but the truck, it's going to need a lot of work. Engine rebuild, new paint." A lot of weekends he paused, his gaze intense. "I'd rather do it with you. The door's open. Come over whenever you want. Even if we don't work on the truck. Even if it's just for coffee." It wasn't a key to his house. It wasn't a grand declaration. It was something better. It was an invitation into his life, into his world. A promise of shared time, of a project to build together. It was a tangible act of commitment. A symbol of a new beginning, forged in our own language of mechanics and quiet companionship. I closed my hand tight around the key, the metal biting into my skin. It was the most real thing I had ever held. "Okay," I said, my voice thick. "Yeah, okay." He didn't kiss me then. He just stood there, smiling that small, incredible smile. And in the middle of my greasy, cluttered garage, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, everything felt right. The chaos had settled. The storm had passed. The weeks that followed unfolded with a slow, gentle rhythm. We worked on the truck, Saturdays and Sundays, and sometimes late on weeknights. We'd be in the newly repaired workshop, the space now ours. We'd talk for hours over the roar of a sander or the click of a socket wrench. He told me about his wife, about his life before. I told him about my quiet dreams, my fears. We were rebuilding more than just an engine. We were building a connection, piece by careful piece. There were hesitant kisses over a greasy fender. There were long, comfortable silences that spoke more than words. There was the first time he stayed the night at my tiny apartment, and the first time I woke up next to him and the morning light wasn't something to fear. One Saturday, months later, we were sitting on the tailgate of the truck, the body now primed and smooth, ready for its new coat of seafoam green. We were sharing a beer, watching the sunset paint the sky in strokes of orange and pink. The air was cool, smelling of cut grass and possibility. He slipped his arm around my shoulder, pulling me close. I leaned my head against him, the solid feel of him a constant, reassuring presence in my life. "Liam called," he said quietly. "He's coming home for a visit next month." My body tensed. The final hurdle. The great unknown. "We'll tell him together," Marcus said, as if reading my mind. His grip on my shoulder tightened. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." And I believed him, because we had already faced the storm. Now, when I wake up, it's often to the smell of coffee already brewing. Not the instant kind from that first night, but the good stuff he buys from a local roaster. His kitchen, once a memorial to a past life, is now filled with the small signs of my presence. My favorite mug next to his. My jacket slung over a chair. It's no longer his house. It's our home. Sometimes I look at him, reading the paper at that worn kitchen table, and I think about the man I used to see from a distance. The intimidating, silent figure. It feels like looking at a stranger. The man I know is warm and funny in a dry, sarcastic way. He's a man who still grieves, but who is learning how to live again. A man who holds my hand in the dark and tells me his fears. The storm didn't just break his workshop. It broke open my entire life. It forced me out of my fortress of solitude and into the terrifying, beautiful, chaotic world of loving someone. Marcus wasn't a plot twist I saw coming. He was the quiet, unexpected disruption that rearranged all the pieces of my life into a picture I finally recognized as my own. In that broken garage, covered in mud and fear, I found more than just a project. I found my future. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many of us are living right next door to the one thing that could change our entire lives, separated only by a wall of fear or assumption? Have you ever taken a risk on someone who seemed completely wrong for you on the surface, only to find they were exactly what you needed? Let me know your story in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories about finding love in the most unexpected of places, make sure to subscribe.